Hey everybody, welcome back to Sprague Woodturning. I'm Jim. Hopefully you checked out last week's video, the pewter inlay one. I know it was fun to do. I like doing it anyway. Hopefully you enjoyed it. This week's going to be something a little different. So we're going to take this hideous looking maple natural edge bowl. And when I get done with it, it's going to be a beauty. So there's a big ugly knot here. We're going to punch this knot out after it's been trimmed up. Do an inlay in there. I might actually even do brass shavings and branches. Something we haven't done any branches yet. As you can see, this thing's been sitting in my drying shed since 2012. And yeah, that's what this video is going to be. And I'm actually going to burn the rim too. So anyway, I'll trim this off, get a glue block on the bottom of it, get it mounted on the outside of the lathe. We'll trim it up and start the inlay. So anyway, that's what this week's video is. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. And if you're already subscribed, thank you very much for supporting my channel. So anyway, let's get to the lathe and get some turning done. Should be close enough. Okay, so ordinarily, I've got a router. This is just a homemade router table that I made. Ordinarily, I'd have a 3/8 straight router bit mounted in the router. And if it's out near the rim or on the side, you can easily plunge that down in there and move it around, or come in and cut your groove out, and then finish it up on the lathe with this type of burr here. Now, I can't remember the name of it, but I will, I'll look it up and I'll put it there. But anyway, I've been using this for years, and it's a great thing about it at Lee Valley. I can't remember what it's called though. So anyway, then I'll clean out the groove and everything will look nice and uniform. Try and maybe even give it some style. If you've got a big split in the rim here, I typically don't just go straight in. I'll flare it out like this just to give it some stop. So anyway, what I'll do here is I'll just drill this out with a Forstner bit, and then I'll clean it up with that other burr I just showed you. Okay, so here's my Forstner bit. Now these knots typically don't go straight through. They usually go through on an angle. So I'll try and start this here and then go on an angle. And then I'll use that burr to finish up the inside of this and make it all nice and clean. Okay, let's talk branches for the inlay. So all the branches you see up here, and there's different types. There's sumac, there's some yew. I think that's cherry, oak. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So these have been all kiln dried. If you take these branches and try and inlay them in the bowl when they're green, or you think that they're, relatively dry, I can tell you right now, they're going to shrink and then they're going to fall out of your inlay. So all the stuff has been kiln dried. Make sure that it's down to at least 7% when you inlay it, and you shouldn't have any issues. We've got our hole all cleaned out. There's no sharp, abrupt edges in it. By the way, if you hear that rumbling in the background, don't worry, we're not under attack. It's just we had a thunderstorm coming in by the sounds of it. So what I'm going to do is I'll get some branches. I haven't figured out exactly what they're going to be yet. And I'll cut them so that they stick out past the surface on the back side and on the inside. Then I'll take this back over the grinder, back over to the lathe, and then use the grinder, kind of grind them back almost flush with the surface of the bowl. I might use my my 6-inch sander after that. Put tape on the outside, put the inlay on the inside, tap it all down, hit it with the CA glue, let it set, and then trim it back in all likelihood tomorrow. It depends on the inlay. So that's what we're going to do. We just got to figure out what we're going to use for branches. Okay, so I've decided to go with sumac branches. And I don't know if you're familiar with sumac or not, but this is red sumac. It's got a lot of times some really soft centers. So what you can actually do is after the inlay is in, kind of groove out the center of this and then put the inlay in the center of these as well. We'll see where we're at. The smaller ones are quite unstable, but these ones are actually pretty decent. You can see I just marked that with my nail quite easily. But it also gives you a nice texture after it's sanded too. So it's not all about what it looks like, it's also about feel and texture and, whatever. So that's what we'll do. We'll try and cut up a bunch of these that are the right length, and we'll put them all in there, different sizes like this. Try and fill the inlay in, and then we'll just fill around it with whatever. I think we're going to use brass shavings actually. Okay, so we've got our branches all cut, different sizes. Just listen to that thunder. Woo. So anyway, I'm just going to put these in there and hit them with CA glue. You want them as tight as possible when they go in. After they're all been installed, I really like to even use a hammer to try and knock them in. That way it's just, I know that number one, they're not going to fall out when we go back to the lathe to trim them back before the inlay goes in. But it's just, I know that if there is going to be a little bit of shrinkage, that, you know, there's not going to be an issue where it falls out. So I'm going to try and stay out of the way here, but I don't know if that's going to be possible. And what I'll do a lot of times is I'll just set these branches in, and then I'll hit them with CA glue. And the glue we're using today is actually from Starbond. I like to use the thin stuff. It penetrates well, holds well. And then of course, accelerator. Another thing about using a lathe when there's the potential that the power is going to go out. I don't know if you've realized it or not, but I'm left-handed, so I like to turn on the outboard end of my lathe, and it's on left-hand threads. And then I was turning one day, and there was a storm coming in, and we lost power, and the gouge immediately unspun the bowl from the lathe, and it smashed on the floor. So there, that's where we're at so far. And I'm going to fill in a lot of these little holes here with the thinner branches still here. But, you know, this is an alternative to using epoxy resins and that kind of stuff. I've been doing these for 20 years. But I will be getting into resin stuff, that's for sure. It certainly has its place in the world, there's no doubt about that. Maybe even more than this. With these types of inlays I do, they're natural materials, and people really seem to like them. Okay. So what I'll do now is I'll really hit this with the glue. And if you got any cracks, it certainly will fill in those. You can see the vapors coming off that CA glue. You definitely want to use this in a well-ventilated area. It is very hard on your lungs and on your eyes. So there, we'll let that set up for a minute. We'll go back to the lathe and then we'll grind these off flush. I typically don't really care about the inside. I'll leave that probably how it is. Sometimes I might trim this back a little bit. You know, you can try and use a gouge, but the experience that I've had is that the gouge will end up breaking off pieces of the branches, and then, you know, it just doesn't look good. So that's why I typically grind it off with sandpaper and then put the tape on the outside, and then we'll put our inlay in. Woo. That's okay, Mother Nature. I didn't want my driveway anyway. Okay, so we're back on the lathe. The storm has moved off a bit, still around, but so anyway, we use a grinder. It's like a flap disc or something. Anyway, I'll grind these so that, being careful not to grind past the surface, we want this to protrude out slightly, and then we'll just put some tape on it. It's not a huge deal if you go in a little bit too deep. It's just that you're gonna have to trim the inlay back more and more and more, making the bowl thinner and thinner and thinner as you do that. So anyway, it's not the end of the world if it happens, and it does happen. But anyway, that's it. I'll sand that now and get the inlay in it. Simple old duct tape, any old duct tape. Don't buy the good stuff, just buy the cheap stuff. Okay, so it's finally time to put the material in our inlay. Brass is what we're going to use, and this is finely ground stuff. You know, you can get it from a variety of sources, eBay. If you know somebody that works in the machine shop, that's where you can get it as well. So when you're doing these inlays, it's important that things don't get contaminated. And what I mean by that is I don't want soapstone in with my brass, and I don't want brass in with my soapstone and that kind of stuff. So and the other thing too is if you plan on using a gouge to cut this back, you've got to use something like this brass shavings, soapstone, the softer inlay materials. If you put shell material in there and then hit it with the CA glue, forget it. You'll have to sand it, the whole thing. And you don't want to do that because you will use a ton of sandpaper trying to cut it back. So any of these inlays that I do on the side, I try to use inlay materials that I can actually cut with a gouge. So I just kind of sprinkle it around. Knock on the bowl. And again, I can dump it out onto here and then reuse it. Because that thunder does not want to go away. Now, if this is if you're doing this kind of inlay and you're using soapstone or alabaster, you might want to consider putting a little bit in and then hitting it with the CA glue, thin. And the other thing too I should have mentioned is you've got to use thin CA glue. If you try and use medium, or certainly if you try to use thick, it is not going to work. You need it to go right through the inlay to the other side. And after I figure that I've got it completely glued in there, I don't know if you can see that. Not easy, is it? Shadows. Anyway, we'll peel the tape off the outside, and then if we have to do some filling on the backside, which we usually have to do, then we'll do that then. And if we do happen to have a dry spot, we can address it then. So anyway, I'm just making sure that I fill up this inlay all the way to the surface of the wood. Of course, you don't want to fill it to the top of the branches because you're going to cut those off anyway. There, it's a little hard to show, but anyway, it's all the way to the surface. Again, thin star bond, and just completely saturate it till it won't take no more. One of the things that I don't like to do is sand the surface of the wood prior to using this, because yes, you can get staining from the glue. I find when it's just off from the gouge, it tends to not absorb as much. There. It's all completely to the surface. And if you've got some areas that have cracks down there, run it down over that. There, that's already starting to set up. You can see it kind of smoking. I'll help it along with the accelerator. And again, you don't want to breathe in those fumes. So after this sets, we'll trim it back. We'll do another inlay again, trim that back. Sometimes we have to do another inlay as well. You may have to kind of fool with it right up until you put the finish on it. But when it's done, it's quite nice. And that's exactly what we want to see. The glue has gone right through the inlay. There is a couple of dry spots. So we'll fill those in and hit them with the glue. Oop. She's still rumbling. Just got a notification on my phone that it's over though, so that's good. There, give us some more glue. Now for some reason when you put the glue with the brass here, it seems to really dry very quickly. And I don't know why. Maybe the Starbond people could answer that, but it's good. When you're doing a brass inlay like this, you can actually get right to it. So there you go, we're all filled in. I'll let that sit for a little bit longer, and then we'll go back to the lathe and trim it back. Okay, we are ready for the second filling. Once this gets filled again, and this is all filled in with glue, it'll eliminate this tear out that we're getting from the branches. On the back side, shiny. That's what it looks like. And again, this still has some areas that need to be filled in. A lot of times at this stage I'll just use the glue, but there's some little areas there that some voids. Not as easy to see on the inside. Maybe you can see it there. Anyway, again, careful not to contaminate your inlay area. Before I came over here, I blew myself all off with the air hose. And this time I'm going to be a little more careful with the glue. I don't really want it spilling over and going into areas that I really don't want it to go into. Because yes, it can stain stuff. I like these tip extensions that you can get from Starbond. Really handy. Put the glue exactly where you want it. Anyway, back to the lathe. Okay, so we're at our last filling. Everything has been sanded to 320, including the rim. I just need to break this edge with some sandpaper. So what I'm going to do now is fill in any little tiny holes that I see with the glue, and then put it back on the lathe and sand it and blend it in, and then that's it. We'll be ready for burning. And yeah, it can be aggravating, filling and sanding and filling and sanding. But you know, the end result, I don't know, you be the judge. But epoxy and resins and all that, that is on the horizon for me. I've got some ideas with that. There. I think we got her. That way we'll sand that back with 320 and then burn the rim. Okay, so it's time to burn the rim. Everything's sanded to 320. The rim's been sanded to 320. The edge has been broke on it. And so now we're going to take the torch and burn the rim. Now you could use some sort of black ink or whatever, but you know, I prefer this. I know that this is non-toxic. It'll get sealed in with the finish that I use, and you won't know the difference. So one of the things to note, when you're burning the rim, you need to be straight on to the rim. If you are off to the side at all when doing it, you're going to get black either on the inside or the outside of the bowl. You're still going to probably get some as it is, but as long as you keep the torch straight on to the rim, you shouldn't have any issues. There you have it. Now what I'll do is I'll put the 320 back on the sander and just sand from the base of the bowl out to the rim on the inside and the outside, just to try and crispen up the edge a bit. And then that's it, it's ready for finish. Now I'm not going to touch that rim. It's just as I left it burnt. Of course, when I put the finish on, I'll have to do that, and that will actually even things out if it's lighter or darker in certain areas. But yeah, first coat of finish coming up. Okay, so when the finish goes on, I'll do the rim last. And the reason for that is I don't want the blackness transferred to my cloth while I'm doing the back side. Excuse me. Yeah, dusty. So I'll do the inside of the bowl all the way to the rim without touching the rim itself. Same thing on the back side of the bowl, and then we'll do the rim last. Again, I'm using salad bowl finish by General Finishes. You'll get a real heavy coat, the first coat. Sometimes you can get away with 2 coats. I use 4-0 steel wool or Scotch Brite pads between coats. But I find the 4-0 steel wool is my preferred thing to cut the finish back between coats. And I'll try and stay away from that rim. Now the reason that I'm going to put 3 coats on this is to seal the burnt part in. If you don't, you might find that the black will come off in your hands later on when it's being washed. And again, when I make things for function. This is a functional salad bowl. So I just keep putting the finish on until it won't take any more. And it just brings the wood alive. And this is a good hard finish. It takes a lot to scratch, very durable. Been using it for years and really like it. So here we are on the back side. And I like to put it in these squeeze bottles. It's just easier to control, easier to apply. You don't return a brush to a can, so you're not basically contaminating the finish when it's in the can, because it's poured into these bottles. The only thing with doing shiny finishes, you got to be really good with your sanding. If you're not good with your sanding, it will show up in the end. Here we go. And I like the contrasting black with the light wood. So it will be good and sealed in there after 3 coats, and you won't have to worry about any of the charred blackness coming off in your hands. There, one last look at it. And that's why I mean you don't do the rim till last. And this will even it out. Even out the burn, if you will. There. We'll do the 2nd and 3rd coat tomorrow and finish it up. Okay, this is the last coat. Use the 4-0 steel wool, strip it off, and then get our last coat finish on. I do have the luxury of a variable speed lathe that I can dial down really slow like this. If you don't, you probably just have to spin the bowl by hand, that's all. So yeah, this is, of course, this last coat is probably going to just sit on the surface. So make sure you don't put on too much, because you don't want any runs or sags in it. These natural edge bowls with the bark off, or actually, you know, the bark is nice and I prefer to leave the bark on these bowls, but it doesn't always work that way. Typically, if you cut a bowl in the wintertime, when you cut a tree in the wintertime, when the sap is predominantly out of the tree, there's a greater likelihood that the bark will stay on the bowl when it dries. If you cut a tree in the middle of the summer, it's going to be really tough to keep the bark on it because the bark will tend to shrink a lot faster than the wood. So there, I realize that shiny is not everybody's thing, but it certainly is mine. I'm not going to show finishing the bottom of the bowl. If you're curious how the bottoms of the bowls are done, I just use a vacuum chuck. I cut it off the waste block with a parting tool, and that's covered in other videos on my channel as well. So feel free to check it out. Okay, so we're done. I've parted this off of the waste block, and that's typically how I sign the bottoms of my bowls. It still needs 2 coats of finish on it, but I got to get this edited and uploaded. So yeah, 3 coats of finish. There's the inlay. And it's hard to shoot video. It's very shiny. And again, that's sumac branches and brass shavings. This is what it's like on the inside. And that just goes to show you that, you know, in the beginning, a lot of people would have passed on this and said, nah, that's firewood. I'm not going to fix that. But, I mean, look at the results. Again, 3 coats of solid bowl finish. The rim was burnt to give it some contrast. Maple. And it's a beauty now. And it's something that, you know, if you make something like this, put your signature on the bottom of it. Be proud of it. Yeah, so if you're new here, please consider subscribing. And don't forget that little bell. You'll know when I put up a new video. Anyway, have a good weekend. Take care. Stay safe. And we'll see you at the next one.